It all started on a quiet Sunday morning when I was out by the edge of my ranch, just checking up on the pond like I usually do. The sky was clear, the birds were out, and everything seemed peaceful till the sound of screeching tires shattered the calm. That's when she showed up. Karen, the self-appointed ruler of the nearby HOA community, who somehow thinks she has authority over land that's not even part of her neighborhood. With a phone in one hand and a finger pointing straight at my pond, she was already shouting before I could say a word. Apparently, Karen thought my ranch pond, yes, a natural pond, was an illegal swimming pool and a safety hazard. For the local kids, mind you, those kids don't even live near me. I tried to explain it wasn't a pool, and it sure as heck wasn't her business, but she wasn't hearing it. The next thing I know, she's calling the cops, making a big, dramatic scene like she's starring in her own reality show. Now, here's where it gets wild. What Karen didn't know and what made the cops pause real fast says that the pond she was yelling about isn't just some random body of water. It's actually part of a government-backed conservation and military training project. Yup, that same pond is occasionally used by veterans and trained service dogs for lump-packed recovery drills and survival exercises. It's been that way for years, with permits and all. Karen had no clue. The officers started asking her the questions, and the expression on her face changed real quick. But just when I thought things were calming down, something else happened that none of us expected. And trust me, you're gonna want to stick around for what came next. So while the officers were still standing there, trying to make sense of what Karen had just dragged them into, I walked them over to the edge of the pond. I pointed out the clearly marked signs, weathered but still readable, that explained its use as part of a joint conservation and military support program. You'd think that would have been enough to clear the air, right? But no. Karen doubled down. She started accusing me of faking government permits, saying the whole thing was a setup to avoid HOA guidelines. Like I said before, my ranch isn't even inside the HOA's reach, but facts didn't seem to matter much to her. The officers, to their credit, stayed calm. One of them started radioing in to confirm the details I'd given, while the other asked Karen if she had any paperwork to back up her complaint. She didn't, of course. She just kept insisting the pond was a danger to the community aesthetic, whatever that means, and went off about property values. Meanwhile, I could see my neighbor Tom pulling up in his truck. He's a retired Army medic and one of the veterans who sometimes helps with the recovery sessions out by the pond. When Tom stepped out and saw the scene, his face said it all. He knew something had blown way out of proportion. He started walking over, slow and steady, and you could just feel the tension shift. Karen didn't recognize him, at least not right away. But the moment he introduced himself and explained his involvement in the program, things started getting real uncomfortable for her. Still, before anything could be settled, a black SUV rolled up to the gate. No one was expecting that vehicle, not even the cops. And the person who stepped out, let's just say their presence, changed the tone of everything. The door of the black SUV swung open, and out stepped a woman in a dark green jacket with a federal badge clipped to her belt. She didn't waste time, walked straight up to the officers, said something quietly, then glanced over at me and Tom. Karen, still mid-rant about unauthorized structures, didn't seem to notice the shift. Not until the woman turned toward her and calmly said, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to take a step back and stop recording." Karen froze. That badge wasn't decorative. It belonged to someone from the Department of Land and Resource Management. Someone I'd dealt with before during the early stages of the pond's designation for military use support. The officer, Agent Ruiz, introduced herself to the group and asked if anyone had been injured or if there had been any safety threats. When the answer was no, she turned her attention to the documentation. As I handed over the folder from the house with copies of every permit and email from the program's coordinators, Karen suddenly changed tactics. Now she claimed I was hosting illegal military drills, endangering wildlife, and disrupting the peace of her morning yoga. Ruiz didn't even blink. Meanwhile, Tom quietly stepped aside to make a call. What Karen didn't know was that he wasn't just a veteran. He also volunteers with a local nonprofit that partners with state agencies to support PTSD recovery efforts for veterans. The pond plays a big role in that work, and there had even been talks about expanding the program. Her complaint, if taken seriously, could put all of that at risk. The irony? Just across from the ranch, behind Karen's perfectly trimmed hedges, there's a noisy construction site for a new HOA clubhouse, and no one filed the proper environmental impact reports for it. That little detail hadn't come up yet, but it was about to, and when it did, everything would start unraveling fast. Agent Ruiz flipped through the paperwork carefully, her eyes scanning the permits, approvals, and the old maps showing the pond's natural flow and runoff channels. Karen was pacing now, arms crossed, mumbling under her breath about favoritism and cover-ups. She had stopped yelling, but you could tell she was still boiling inside. The officer stayed quiet, letting Ruiz take the lead. Then, just as she was about to speak, Tom returned from his call with a serious look on his face. He leaned in and whispered something to Ruiz, who nodded slightly. Then she looked over at Karen. "Ma'am, are you aware of the construction taking place behind your residence?" Karen stiffened. "Of course," she snapped. "It's an HOA-approved clubhouse for community gatherings. It's perfectly legal." But the moment she said it, Ruiz opened her tablet and pulled up a document. Her tone stayed calm, but her words carried weight. "There are no active filings with the county for land modification or noise exemption in that zone. In fact, it appears the area is part of a migratory bird corridor." Karen's face went pale as that bombshell hung in the air. A pickup truck pulled up along the fence line. Out stepped Noah, another neighbor and a wildlife biologist who'd been helping monitor the pond's ecosystem for the last year. He wasn't supposed to be involved in any of this, but word must have gotten out. Without even greeting anyone, he walked straight toward us, holding a file folder of printed photos, nesting sites, bird tags, and soil samples. "They've been dumping runoff from the clubhouse site right near the pond's western edge," he said. "If it continues, it could destroy part of the wetland buffer." That was it. What started as a false complaint about a pond suddenly turned into something much bigger. Chain reaction threatening military therapy programs, wildlife, and possibly exposing a whole HOA project running under the radar. Ruiz signaled to one of the officers, and they quietly stepped away to make a call. Everyone stood in silence, tension thick in the air. We all knew something big was about to drop, just as the officer finished his call and started walking back. We all heard the low hum of a drone overhead. At first, we thought it might be one of those recreational ones kids fly around. But this one was different. It hovered with precision, circling right above the pond, then slowly drifting toward the HOA construction site. Everyone looked up. Karen's eyes widened. "That's private airspace," she snapped. But Agent Ruiz just raised an eyebrow. Noah looked at the drone and muttered, "That's a surveying drone. ... Someone's documenting this." Sure enough, a few seconds later, his phone buzzed. He glanced down, then looked at Ruiz and said, "They just sent me aerials from last week. Want to see where the runoff actually flows." Ruiz nodded, and Noah handed her the screen. The images showed everything: disrupted soil, diverted water lines, even traces of chemical residue leaking from the edge of the construction into the protected marshland. Karen suddenly looked nervous in a different way. She wasn't just worried about her complaint anymore. She realized this had spun far beyond her control. Ruiz handed the phone to the officer, who quietly started snapping photos of the screen with his department-issued phone. Then Ruiz turned back to Karen, asking flatly, "Who's the project lead for the clubhouse construction?" Karen hesitated. "Well, the board approved it," she said carefully. "But I helped with the proposal." Before anyone could respond, another car pulled up fast. This time it was someone from the county's environmental division. Apparently, Tom's earlier call had triggered more than just a routine check-in. As the new official walked over with a briefcase and a serious look, the weight of everything started crashing down. This wasn't just a nosy neighbor with an attitude. It was starting to look like someone had knowingly bypassed environmental law for personal or HOA gain. And right then, Ruiz got another call. She stepped aside to answer, and the few words we overheard sent chills through the group. Something had just come to light that none of us were prepared for. Agent Ruiz stepped away from the group to take the call, and we all stood there trying to read her expression. Her face was tight, focused, like she was piecing something big together. When she came back, she didn't say a word at first, just looked straight at Karen, then slowly turned toward the environmental official who had just arrived. "We have confirmation," she said, voice steady but sharp. "The HOA construction site has been flagged, not just for runoff violations, but for falsified permits submitted using a shell LLC tied to several board members. And your name?" "Ma'am," she said, nodding at Karen, "is listed as the secondary contact." Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She glanced at the officers, at the neighbors gathering near the fence line, and finally at the drone still hovering overhead, capturing every second. The same HOA that had tried to call me out over a legally designated military-use pond was now being exposed for environmental violations, permit fraud, and possibly misuse of funds. The irony was almost too perfect. The officers moved quickly. Then, one started taking Karen's full statement while the environmental official began marking off sections of the construction site with yellow tape. Ruiz told me and Tom to keep the ponds program running as usual, and said her office would be following up about additional security since the project now involved federal interest. Just when I thought that was the end of it, Noah got another message, this one from someone inside the HOA board who had been suspicious for a while. Turned out Karen had been pushing for the clubhouse, not for the community, but because she had already pitched a private event service to rent it out once it was finished. Profits would have gone through that same shady LLC. She wasn't just nosy, she had a whole plan behind the scenes. So yeah, what started as a ridiculous call about my pond ended up exposing a much bigger mess. And somehow, the peaceful water out back turned out to be the one thing that saved our whole community in the weeks that followed. Everything started coming into focus. The HOA board launched an internal investigation, and several members quietly resigned, including Karen. The clubhouse construction was halted indefinitely while the county sorted through the legal and environmental violations. As for the pond, it stayed right where it belonged, calm, clear, and protected. With the spotlight off the false complaints, the Veterans Recovery Program was allowed to expand, and we even got a small grant for wildlife conservation, thanks to the drone footage and Noah's data. Karen never apologized directly, but word got around that she sold her house a few streets over and moved out of the area. I'm not sure where she ended up, but around here, people finally started understanding the value of what that pond actually meant. It wasn't just a body of water. It was a lifeline for veterans, a home for local wildlife, and a peaceful corner of land with a purpose far bigger than a backyard argument. Tom and I hosted a small gathering not long after. Just a few neighbors, some of the vets, and the folks who had quietly supported the project all along. We stood by the edge of the pond, watching the sun reflect off the surface, grateful that things had played out the way they did. Devin, if it all started with sirens and shouting. So yeah, sometimes what looks like a simple misunderstanding can reveal a whole lot more. And sometimes the quietest places are the ones that hold the most power. If you've got something worth protecting, whether it's land, people, or peace, stand your ground. Because you never know when the truth will rise to the surface. And in my case, it all started with a pond that was never just a pond.